Hello YouTubers, I hope you're having a great day today. I want to talk to you a whole lot about one of my passions since I left college, and that's H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu Mythos. H.P. Lovecraft is one of the most definitive horror writers out there. Either him or Edgar Allan Poe are going to be who you consider to be the greatest American horror writer of all time. Both of them are hugely influential. I think most people, and I would probably choose Poe too, are going to choose Poe, but Lovecraft is definitely in the conversation, and if he's not, and he's definitely going to be like one of your Mount Rushmore of American horror writers. Most people are probably going to have as their Mount Rushmore Poe, Lovecraft, King, and then choose your own for the fourth one of the definitive four iconic American horror writers of all time. He's just absolutely somebody who's definitive. He's somebody who has really influenced a lot of stuff. I've read everything he's written, and I just absolutely loved it. I encountered it when I was in college, when I picked up a book that was published by Del Rey, which published a lot of fantasy that I was reading at the time. So it was a publisher I really trusted. Picked up the book that was a collection of his best stuff, and I really liked it. And then I picked up a lot of his other stuff too and just devoured it. And I still do. I still read a lot of mythos stuff. And Lovecraft's mythos, his Cthulhu Mythos, is his iconic creation. It's created over time in multiple stories, although it's probably most popularized in a story called The Call of Cthulhu, which is where the mythos gets probably its namesake creature and the name of the mythos moving forward. Now, Lovecraft has a lot of very different style of writing. He writes very much a style of cosmic horror. The key for him is not these sort of quick little body horror freezes, or that somebody's hurting you and you're being locked up behind a door in the cellar, like Poe or something like that. Instead, it's much more big picture than that. For him, it's more of an intellectual horror. The idea, the realization that we are so small, so insignificant, that if the big powers out there cared, we wouldn't even exist, but we're like ants to them. We are nothing. We are tiny little insignificant things in the giant cosmos, and it's a cosmos of people that just don't like us. They don't like me, they don't like you, but they just don't care to bother to brush us off their shoulder and take us out. So that's basically the sort of core concept, that the universe doesn't care about you, it doesn't care about me. There's nobody out there to help us out. We're all alone, and we're just a tiny, insignificant little nothing. And all the effort that we have created as humanity is going to be doomed, because there's just nothing out there to help us out. There's nothing out there to care about us at all. That's sort of the basic core concept of kind of this Lovecraftian cosmic horror. He gets that from some other people previously. Now, the Cthulhu Mythos is very interesting. What I want to do to you for today in today's video is look at my sort of characterizations of the mythos and what I have created. When I look at the mythos, I've put it in different generations. Different generations have different themes, different ways they're playing with it, that the writers are popularizing it, and so forth. So what I want to do to you today is kind of unlock those different generations, the different aspects of the mythos, and talk about that. Now, the mythos itself is very different. We will be doing a number of these reviews are going to be looking at different major works in the mythos. We're going to do a review of The Call of Cthulhu, Shadow over Innsmouth, many other Lovecraftian works are on the table. I probably have at least 40 or 50 videos planned that are going to be Cthulhu Mythos alone. In addition to a lot of other things. I just wanted to wait before we got started. And I wanted to do this video before I did any other mythos works, because I wanted to get this out of the way, clear the context. This is going to be where the terms that I'm going to be using throughout my videos in the mythos, where they're coming from and such. So let's go ahead and take a look and kind of drop right in. So the Cthulhu Mythos, it starts when he starts writing his stories in his more Mythosian stories in the 1920s. And there are a number of stories that he writes before then. And one of the things that really sort of highlights and makes the Cthulhu Mythos itself is that it has they're all set in the same world, and they have a number of borrowed elements. So what he does is he starts using elements and ideas that he gets from previous writers that wrote before him, which I'm going to be calling Generation Zero. And then during the time that he's writing, many other writers are going to cross the streams, and they're going to be borrowing, characters and settings and items and such from each other and using them in each other's works. And this will create the Cthulhu Mythos. It's not just Lovecraft who creates it, although he's the creator of the main characters and the main concept, but many other people who are writing at the same time as Lovecraft are going to be sharing characters and stories. Like, for example, he'll take a god that Clark Ashton Smith creates in one of his fantasy stories called Cthulhu. He'll take that and bring it over to his Cthulhu Mythos, and he'll make it one of the bad guys in the Cthulhu Mythos. Similarly, there's going to be, he's famous for creating this book called the Necronomicon in an earlier story, which he uses multiple times before he even finishes the file of Cthulhu and creates the Mythos. So the Necronomicon and its writer are going to have major players, and other sort of forgotten and ancient texts that are no longer with us, that were removed because they were really bad and such, are also out there too. They're going to be created by himself and other writers, and they're going to be brought in. So there are a number of these characters, settings, magical items, and so forth that are going to be moving from one setting to another and from one writer to another. And everybody from Robert E. Howard, who wrote the Conan stuff, to Clark Ashton Smith, who wrote a ton of fantasy stuff, and many more. Mainly Wade Wellman, Donald Wandre, Frank Belknap Long. There's a lot of writers out there for whom they're going to be writing stuff in the Cthulhu Mythos. I think the mythos really sort of gets started, though, with Generation Zero. And these are works that are pre-Lovecraft. So when I use the term Generation Zero or Gen Zero, what I'm referring to are works that came about before Lovecraft started writing his mythos stuff. They're kind of the inspiration for the mythos. And one example of that's Ambrose Bierce. And Ambrose Bierce is a famous writer from earlier in American history, who writes some stuff that you probably still read today, like Devil's Dictionary. He wrote a ton of horror stuff, some of which was canonized. You can see it in like An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. It's a great story. It's oftentimes read in like high school or junior high English textbooks. It's been turned into movies and Twilight Zone episodes that are really good. And multiple examples of that out there. He created ideas and concepts like Carcosa, Halley, and such. And another of the people out there is going to be Arthur Machen, who Lovecraft is definitely going to sort of bring his kind of concepts into. He's a famous horror writer who wrote a lot of weird fiction from the Isles. But for me, the one that really sort of puts it together is going to be Robert Chambers. Now, Robert Chambers The King in Yellow is the only thing that he wrote that still resonated with him. He was heavily educated, a great writer. He was hugely influential during his day, and widely read. But you probably haven't heard from him unless you're interested in horror and specifically the Cthulhu Mythos. His work has been very resonant. You're going to see his central concepts, but he has this idea of the play called The King in Yellow, which you can't hear or read without going insane, which is definitely very much like the Necronomicon and these other ancient texts that Lovecraft is going to choose. He also takes a lot of things that Chambers takes a lot of things that he saw from other works like Ambrose Bierce, like Carcosa and Lake Halley and stuff, and brings it into his own works. And so one of the things you're going to see is Lovecraft does the same thing. He's going to take a lot of things from Chambers' works, or Algernon Blackwood's Wendigo story and such, that are going to be ones that are very much wholesale and sort of inspiring the mythos and kind of brought in themselves. So the Gen Zero are the writers that write before Lovecraft's mythos kind of get started. Some of them have brought it wholesale, while as others are sort of like spiritual sort of predecessors that are going to kind of sort of inspire the mythos, the borrowing of elements from one story to the next and such. So Gen Zero. Now I'm, as somebody whose number one strength is context, and I'll give you a link to the video below if you want to find out more about that. I care a lot about older stuff, how things came to be and such. So for me, the Generation Zero is still my fascination. I love reading, horror stories that were written before they were troped and genrefied. And at the earlier parts of the stuff, it's just great stuff. It's just incredibly great to read. It's so evocative and so much fun. And it's also very good because the stories have stood the test of time. You know, The King in Yellow is a set of 5 classic short stories, you know, and there are many others from this era that are definitely classics, that have been canonized, that are part of, you know, classics and collections that's still around. So I really enjoy going out and reading these sort of main stories. And I'm going to be giving you some reviews for a lot of these Gen Zero horror stories moving forward. I've already done one for Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, which comes from Gen Zero. So then we're going to move forward to Gen 1. Now the major Gen 1 writer is obviously going to be H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft is the biggest, you know, horror writer. That's why we're having this video, and many others to come follow. And he's going to write a lot of stuff. There's also going to be a number of sort of Gen 1 writers that are going to be writing at the same time as Lovecraft. And that's important to kind of understand, too. I mean, there's going to be dozens of them. And they're going to be people from Robert E. Howard, who wrote a number of Mythos collections here. He's the guy who wrote, like I said, Conan the Barbarian. Is probably more popular for creating him. And then you also are going to have Clark Ashton Smith, again, who I mentioned earlier, and that, you know, or even Frank Belknap Long, who writes a couple of stories in the Cthulhu Mythos, and he's also pretty popular for the time as well. And again, there's going to be many others, from Donald Wandre and August Derleth to Robert Barlow and stuff. So there's going to be a number of writers out there that are writing in the Mythos. So the Gen 1 is kind of when it's fresh. Lovecraft is really sort of encouraging people, if they write something, even if he doesn't think it's the best written stuff ever, he brings it in. Let's get it in. Everything from Richard Seawright's Sealed Casket and the Eltdown Shards to you know, Donald Wandry's stuff. And so there's a lot of people writing that he's going to bring in. And I'm going to have, it's not going to be a part of this video. I'm actually intending to write a review on this video later, a separate sort of context on Lovecraft later on about his letter writing. I think Lovecraft is arguably the most important writer of letters in the 20th century. I'm going to make that argument in a separate video. But he is a huge writer of letters, and he really reached out and connected with a lot of writers and fans of the genre, and he really mentored a lot of big name writers that would come along later, like you know, Fritz Leiber, for example, who was mentored by Lovecraft and would publish his first work shortly after Lovecraft died. And there are many others too, big names in horror like Robert Bloch. So there's a lot of big names out there and that have written a lot of stuff that were sort of encouraged by Lovecraft. And we're sort of his proteges and wrote a lot of stuff in the Mythos. And so you're going to go out there and read a lot of stuff out there by a lot of these people that are Gen 1. Gen 1 is a lot about coming up with new ideas, being fresh, bringing them in, sharing different things, and tapping each other in. It's new, it's fresh, it's when the Mythos is at its most pure. Until the 4th gen, it's probably its most pure, and it's not troped yet. It's not a separate subgenre of horror where we know all the trappings that are going to happen. There's a lot of interesting settings. There are going to be Gen 1 stories that are set in the past. For example, Robert E. Howard writes one that's set during the Roman Empire in the British Isles and such. So there's going to be a number of stories that are going to move through time. There's going to be some in the future. There's going to be some in the past. There's going to be some all around the world. While Lovecraft himself really enjoys writing in New England, because that's what he knows, lots of other people are going to come along. They're going to write in Africa. You've got stories that are being written in Gen 1, like Winged Death or The Tree Men of Amboise by Donald Wandre, that are being set in Africa. Robert E. Howard is doing stuff in South Africa or in America or in Arabia and such. So there's a lot of different people that are writing stories in lots of different places around the world, not just, you know, Lovecraft's New England. So because of that, Gen 1 is very fresh, very interesting, and there's a lot of great stuff being written then. The writing sometimes can be great, and sometimes it's a little less, but that's okay because it just has this energy, this verve to it. So Gen 1 will be from basically the time Lovecraft starts writing in the 20s, his Mythos stuff, until right after he passes in the late 30s. I consider Gen 1 sort of finishing properly at 1940. So around 1939 or 40 is when sort of the fresh Gen 1 stuff. There are a number of Gen 1 writers who will write like sort of homages to Lovecraft right after he dies. Like Manly Wade Waldman, for example, had never actually written a story in the Lovecraft Mythos until after Lovecraft dies, and then he'll write a story post Lovecraft's death that sort of honors him that's in the Mythos. You'll see a number of writers who will do that. after he passes. So again, I consider Gen 1 to finish properly then in about 1940. Moving from about 1940 till around 1960, 65 or so is going to be Gen 2. Gen 2 is going to be not owned by Lovecraft. This is actually going to be August Derleth's era of the mythos. What August Derleth is going to do is, as well as some other people like Donald Wandre, he is going to found a book publishing company called Arkham House, which is going to publish initially Lovecraft stuff and keep it alive in the public conscious. He'll also publish some other pulp era stuff and some such from this smaller publishing house that he founds. And again, his passion is to keep Lovecraft alive. And we probably would not know who Lovecraft is today without August Derleth and his other founding, Arkham House and keeping it alive. So, to be fair to Derleth, good job. He's a huge fan of Lovecraft. This was one of his big proteges. He will change the mythos in multiple ways. He'll add an elemental aspect to it, where some of the people are fire or air or water sort of elementals. Like Cthulhu, he'll give a water elemental sort of style to. He also adds this good versus evil layer onto it. The elder ones versus, the elder gods versus the great old ones, as this sort of central conflict with more good versus evil overtones than we had before. Although there are some stories in Gen 1 that have a good versus evil overtone, and there are some that have a sort of lesser elemental thing. But the big issue I have with Derleth is that he will reveal all this stuff. Lovecraft, even if he had desired to do elementals and the strong good versus evil sort of, he doesn't bring it out in his stories. It's not forefront. And Derleth, almost every single page he writes in a mythos story is going to have that in it. He's going to tell you. And it feels like he's like the magician who, instead of creating his own tricks, is going to make a living by revealing the tricks of other people and show you how they did it. He's not somebody who's particularly good as an artist. But to be fair, he continued this stuff and he kept it sort of going. And there's going to be a number of writers who are going to write during Gen 2. Gen 2 is about a lot of exploring sort of the mythos, filling in gaps. Derleth, comes up, has this elemental idea, looks at them and says, well, we don't have a fire elemental bad guy, so let's create one. He creates Cthulhu. He has Ithaqua the Walker on the Wind, who he creates, who is a wind elemental and such. So he'll create people that are sort of to fill in the gaps of this framework that he has come up with to kind of explain the mythos. And so that's a lot of the sort of the Gen 2 stuff, kind of sustaining and filling in gaps. And it's going to be a little less sort of outside the box. Now, there's still going to be lots of new stuff that are happening in there, but again, it's going to be a lot more of a sort of a Christianization of the mythos in a lot of major ways. And August Derleth is going to be the major voice. And one of the seminal works of that era is going to be a book that he's going to publish called Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos. Now, this specific book was a later copy that was published by Del Rey, and they added some additional works to it, although they used the same title. But he's actually going to publish this work, and it's going to be incredibly influential. It's going to have a number of stories in it from Gen 1 and some early Gen 2 stuff. And this is a Gen 2 book that really sort of popularizes the mythos. And a number of famous writers, and especially horror writers, are actually going to first experience the mythos from Derleth's Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, a collection of stuff. So it's an important collection for the time and for pushing the mythos forward, and really for kind of moving to Gen 3. So Gen 3 I consider to start in the early 60s, and then it'll probably go through 1980 or 79. And it's really going to be, it's like August Derleth was the main leader of Gen 2. Gen 3 is really going to be kind of led by Lynn Carter. Lynn Carter is a big, huge fan of fantasy, science fiction, and horror. He read Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos and was influenced and was sort of introduced to the mythos. Like myself, he probably shares a contact strength. He just loved reading some of the older stuff. I consider Lynn Carter actually to be one of the most important editors of these three genres ever, because he brought and popularized a lot of things from older and kept them alive in the public conscience while he edited a series of adult fantasy for Ballantine Books, the first major series by a major publishing house. And he would publish books like early stuff by Clark Ashton Smith that had never been republished, Lovecraft, and lots of other big name writers from the Worm Ouroboros and such. So he has this adult fantasy series that he publishes, and as a part of it, he's going to find a lot of famous writers too, like Catherine Kurtz, and her Dorini series is going to start being published under Carter. So he'll publish some new stuff too, but he is really, really passionate about bringing and sort of bring up all these hidden treasures of the early part of the genre that he loves so much. He's a great editor for that reason. I think he's one of the most influential editors of the era for that reason. But Gen 3 has a lot of writers in it, like Philip Jose Farmer, Lynn Carter, and so forth. And what they're doing, for the most part, is that Gen 3 tends to be probably the most derivative and sort of trope-filled of the generations. If you pick up a Mythos story that's written in Generation 3, there's going to be a tendency for it to have all the same tones. It's going to be set in a place that feels like of Lovecraft's New England, if not literally Lovecraft's New England. It's going to have sacrifices, cultists trying to summon a bad guy, dark text that you're going to find that's going to send you mad. It's going to have all the tropes of a Lovecraftian story and the Cthulhu Mythos without any of the redeeming qualities therein. It's not going to be fresh, it's not going to be interesting, it's not going to do it from a new way or a new perspective. Now there are going to be, like all these generations, there are going to be stories that kind of break outside of the trends, and there are going to be some that break outside of Gen 3. For example, Lynn Carter himself will write stories that kind of like Derleth will fill in some gaps, but not like these major gaps sort of in the elemental structure, but just, hey, I want to create there was somebody who's mentioned in a story like 25 years ago. Let me write a story about that person. And it's a 5-6 page story. It's very derivative, very trope filled. It's not anything new or interesting, but it checks the box of, hey, okay, here's what that story is, and here's what that person means, and what that character is, and what that references to. So he has a lot of that in his stories. And he's not the only one, but Gen 3 is really Lynn Carter's. He really leads that, and so forth. And it's very derivative and sort of trope filled. And then the end of that, the end of Gen 3 and the beginning of Gen 4, which is what we're currently in right now, which probably starts in 1980 going through to today, was New Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, edited by Ramsey Campbell. And this book is very important because what it does is first of all, he'll bring to the table a lot of big name writers that you may not have normally associated with the mythos, like Stephen King or David Drake, who's a military science fiction writer. And you're going to see him bring in a lot of people moving forward. A lot of people are going to write in the mythos in Gen 4, and from Roger Zelazny to Neil Gaiman to Grant Morrison are all going to write short stories or novellas or novels written in and there's also going to be a huge number of comics that are going to get started written too. And so, again, there's a large number of people that are writing now. In the mythos, in Gen 3 was kind of very trope-filled and kind of, making sure that you're following all the sort of steps in order of the mythos story. But Gen 4 is much more fresh. The stories live on their own. They have their own feel. They're very distinct from each other, much like Gen 1. They're using the mythos elements to give it flavor, to give it character, and so forth. And there are a lot of these incredibly gifted and talented writers who are writing stories in the mythos. And they're very different stories. Just reading Grant Morrison's story versus somebody's story like, say, Neil Gaiman's A Study in Emerald, or the 24 Views of Mount Fuji by Roger Zelazny, which won an award for Best Novella that year. And so there are a lot of these different stories and have radically different feels. One is set in Japan, one is set in in the past, in a New England town, and and so on and so forth. And so they all have these different places, the different feels and such. And while I don't like all of them, Gen 4 definitely has and there are going to be, again, some exceptions. There are going to be the occasional Gen 4 book you pick up that's going to read very much like a Gen 1, 2, or 3, rather than a fresh kind of Gen 4 perspective. The simple fact of the matter is that there's a number of people that are writing in Gen 4 that are fresh and interesting, and also a number of people that are writing that are more Lovecraftian than they are mythos. And they may not be writing stories that are specifically set in the mythos, but which are definitely Lovecraftian in nature. And people like Poppy Z. Bright, for example, is one such writer out there who's like that. There are a few others out there too that really sort of resonate, but their works aren't specifically in the mythos. They're not, using the Necronomicon or some character from a work that was originally created, in the 20s, but instead now they're doing something very different with it, but in the style of a Lovecraft, and so you got to respect those people too. So he's definitely still out there. So those are my different generations: Gen 0, kind of pre-Gen 1 stuff, before Lovecraft started writing the mythos. Gen 1 are from about the mid-20s till about 1940, when Lovecraft is writing his mythos stuff, and there are a huge number of writers at the same time who are sort of interpopulating each other's stories with characters and concepts and items and locations. And they're all kind of setting their stories in the same world as a result. And then you have the Gen 2 under Derleth from about 1940 to about 1965-ish. And then that's going to be where they're kind of filling in the gaps. They're kind of adding a lot of things to the mythos itself, including things like elemental aspects, a Christianization of the mythos, and such under Derleth's care. And then you're going to have a number of people writing in Gen 3 that are much more derivative and trope-filled. They really enjoyed sort of the typical traditional sort of mythos story, and that's what they're looking for. It's something that kind of checks those boxes and may do so with a new character or something that had been mentioned a while ago in order to sort of fill in the boxes and fill in the gaps. And then Gen 4 tends to be, from about 1980 on, tends to be much more fresh, much more interesting, with much different sort of settings and characters and such. So those are, again, the different sort of generations that I use. So moving forward, as I start to talk about mythos stories, and I'm going to tell you what generation I think they're a part of and how they sort of play into that. And so I wanted to give you sort of the context of that here in this kind of video. Anyway, if you've read the mythos, I'd love to hear your take on what do you think of my sort of characterizations from Gen 0 to Gen 4. Do you think I was appropriate or not? What do you think of my characterizations and such? Do you think that Gen 3 is ruled by somebody different than Lynn Carter? Do you think that somebody else is in charge of Gen 2 other than Derleth? I don't have anybody in charge of Gen 4, which is probably one of the reasons why it's so fresh. But I'd be interested in kind of hearing what you thought on it, your takes on it and such. I'd be happy to engage you in the comments below. And again, we're going to be doing a lot of stories in the Cthulhu Mythos moving forward, so check it out. If you watch all this, hey, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. We all have busy days and busy lives, and hey, you invested in my video, so I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for that. If you like this video, you definitely want to hit that subscribe button because there's going to be so much great content that's going to follow. This is probably like maybe the 15th or 20th video that I've recorded, but I've already planned. Now, I started when I started this video series, it was like about 50. Now it's about 100 videos that I've already planned, and I've already gotten ready to go. So we've got a lot of things to come. Hit that subscribe button. I guarantee you're going to continue to find some great content. The goal of this channel is to find science fiction, fantasy, and horror stuff that people have not read or experienced, and to give it a place to kind of unpack some great new things. The name of the channel is The Worst Thing About New Books, which is a Joubert quote, who's a French philosophy writer, about the same time that Gen 0 is being written, actually. And he says, his quote is that the worst thing about new books is that they keep us from reading the old books. And so that definitely is something that has resonated with me and is a part of this channel moving forward. So hit that subscribe button. There's going to be a lot more reviews, analysis like this, and such moving forward. So again, thank you so much for your